told me to. My name is John Gutierrez, and I'm director here at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you all tonight to an event marking the New York launch of Lisandro Perez's new and wonderful book, The House on G Street. Lisandro is a sociologist by training, but as he and I have now agreed, he's a historian at heart. He's a professor and former chair of the Department of Latin American and Latinx Studies at John Jay College. I'll try to put it closer. Okay, there we go. Okay. He's a professor and former chair of the Department of Latin American and Latinx Studies at John Jay College. Before that, he was the founding director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, one of the nation's leading research centers on Cuba and Cuban Americans. His previous book, Sugar, Cigars, and Revolution, The Making of Cuban New York, was published by NYU Press in 2018 and received the Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in New York History. So one of the nice things about having Lisandro as a friend and colleague at John Jay is that I was privy to many of the stories in this book before they appeared as words on the page. My office at John Jay until recently faced the department's kitchen, and on most afternoons when Lisandro was on campus, you would see him head into the kitchen in the afternoon and meticulously prepare little cups of Cuban coffee with the espumita just perfect, place them on a plate and offer them to our colleagues in the department. And typically I would get one of the last cups of coffee, and as he offered it to me, he would say something along the lines of, "Oye, encontré algo interesante. Oye, deja que te cuente." And with that, he'd sit in my office and tell me about a destiny-changing lottery ticket, a father and son on opposite sides of Cuba's war for independence from Spain, a not-too-distant cousin who would play a critical and notorious role igniting the Spanish Civil War, a small-town illicit love affair with a tragic denouement. I should point out that the one thing that he didn't mention in those conversations, in all of those conversations, was that he was dropped on his head when he was a baby. I wish he had, because it would explain so many things. In all seriousness, however, seeing these and so many other parts of the Perez Fonts clan's history memorialized in this book is a source of real joy for me, and I believe an important contribution to the historiography on Cuba. There's a point that I wanted to make about the book that I think bears mentioning. And that is, Lisandro points out in his introduction that family history is something that many historians have long struggled to appreciate or even to count as history with a capital H. Driven by notions of history as science and the noble dream of historical objectivity, historians have opted to recount the stories of the men and women of the past without, as Kendra Field noted, investigating the family origins and interior lives of their subjects. Lisandro's book breaks with that long tradition and gives us an intimate look into the interior lives of an elite Cuban family as it navigated the difficult currents of Cuban history. And for that, we should be very, very grateful. Please join me in welcoming Lisandro Perez.
I should start out by saying that, and this is something that's not widely known, but I think it's relevant in this book, that John is from Placetas, which is part of their narrative in this book.
Yes.
But
yeah, and as my mother points out, it is the La Capital de Cuba, or she convinced my kids of this until they actually went there and they realized that she was wrong. But anyway, that's for another time and another book. I'm really from New Jersey, though. Yeah.
So I want to thank John, thank the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies here at the Graduate Center. Special thanks to the person who put it together, the events coordinator, Fatima Perez, who's here. So thank you very much for this. I think my previous book was actually 5 years ago. We did it also here. in this room, under the sponsorship of Price as well. The event is co-sponsored by the Centro Cultural Cubano de Nueva York. And we have here in representation Iraida Iturralde. Iraida, do you want to say just briefly something about the Congreso is coming up? Because that's really,
Yes, this year we're celebrating our 22nd consecutive annual conference. And since it's the 170th anniversary of Jesus' birth, not that of the year, we're going to do Congreso Mariano. And since it will be in Spanish, I'm going to announce the event in Spanish. Otherwise, we won't be. It will be good to go. It's a very como dije ahora, ya tenemos desde los años celebrando el Congreso, este año va a ser un Congreso Mariano. Va a ser extraordinario, incluye desayuno, una herramienta, una presentación musical, fotografías, incluye archivos sobre Martín que nunca se han visto. Tenemos aquí con nosotros nuestra conferenciante magistral de apertura. Tenemos aquí con nosotros. Y les recomiendo a todos que vayan. Mayra ahora está pasando un flyer. Que vayan también a Cuban.center.org, que es nuestro website. Y ahí les tiene todo el congreso y todo lo que está. Así que lo espero. El 12 de noviembre, Lisandro va a estar ahí.
Okay, thanks. Definitely be aligned. Okay, again, thank you very much. Let me do something unusual. I have a few more introductions and acknowledgements to make. But before I do that, I wanted to just start by doing something unusual, which is to read the first paragraph of the acknowledgements of this book. At the core of this book are the family stories I have been depositing and nurturing in my mind for an entire lifetime. My first debt is therefore to those who shared those stories with me, most of whom are long dead but are remembered every day. My mother Nancy, my father Tano, my grandfather Oscar, my uncles Humberto and Sergio, and my aunts Mara, Kela, Leti, Gisela, and Wati, and Sergio's wife, Mari Pedroso. All of those and many more who were alive during the time that I am, that I write this book, that I refer to this time period, have passed. But fortunately, not all of them. There are still 5 people living who were alive when I was born, members of my family, right? And I think as you get older, you appreciate them more and more because there's sort of links to the past. There are people who, literally have known you all your life. That includes my aunt, Marilu, who was present at the launching of the book in Miami. My cousins, Raquelcita, Marita, my uncle Carlos, but also here is one of those persons, and that is my cousin Cristi, right? Who is Mara Cristina Perez, better known in the tri-state area as Chris Ansness, right? And she's here with her husband Bruce and her daughter Brooke. Thank you very much for being here. So I wanted to acknowledge that. That's of my generation. I figured out that there are like 80 living descendants of my grandparents, right? And in many ways, I've written this book for them. Because I've accumulated all these stories, I've done all this research really throughout my life. I've accumulated archives and so forth. And I thought, before I pass, I need to do this. And so in the terms of subsequent generation, I just want to acknowledge the presence of my son, Lisandro, and his wife, Cynthia, okay? So these are just introductions that I need to make because of the nature of this book, which is sort of like very personal, right? And there's one other person I need to acknowledge, and that is a person who had a tremendous, by the way, Chris also, I appreciate that Chris, my cousin, also read an early draft of the manuscript. I wanted her to see if, there was something wrong with my memory or something. She would have remembered if there was anything wrong with it. I want to very much acknowledge Esther Allen, right, who's here. And she was one of the readers that the press sent the manuscript to. And I knew it was her, right? These are supposed to be blind, sort of, because not only did she make all these substantive comments that improved the book, but she's a wordsmith. She's among other things, she's a foremost translator of Martí. And I think she made a lot of also word type corrections, right? Like that, which I really appreciate. Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much. So, as I said, since really I have been a child, I've been gathering all these stories. And I think part of the reason that I was able to do that is because I was a well-behaved child, right? In other words, I was a good listener, right? Adults would talk to me, right? Because I would sit still and listen. I once heard my fun-loving great aunt Consuelo Bullosa say to my mother, "Ay, Nancita, pero este niño es un viejito." This child is a little old man, right? Of course, these stories that I wanted to pass on and that I've accumulated and that I've done research on, the academic in me couldn't just write a book that just had the family stories and just related to family stories. I think it was very important to contextualize those stories, to understand them in the context of the time and place in which those stories were lived out. And I think that context is really important for understanding these stories, because at least I don't understand these stories in a vacuum. I have to connect them with that larger sort of context, the broader historical forces themselves. And there's a growing area of history called microhistory, that in which people are writing family histories as a way of looking at historical processes as they occur, let's say, close to the ground, as they say, right? In other words, the notion of viewing how these broad historical forces that we know took place, especially in the Cuban case, really affected the lives of the individuals who lived, right, through those periods of time. And this book really grows out of, and the reason I decided to write it finally, when I should have probably written it earlier, but you know, everything has its moment, right? Everything has its moment when it's right to do it. And there's some chairs over, Eva, Marilisa, if you want, also in our department. Marilisa is one of my students who's here. Thank you for coming. So I grew out of my previous book because that previous book is about Cubans in New York in the 19th century. And I found that the way I wrote that book was to use a lot of family stories. That is, I put together essentially a portrait of the Cuban community in New York in the 19th century by talking and being able to say the stories of families, where they lived, how they interacted with their, political, social, cultural milieu. And I said, I had fun doing that. I mean, I don't know why I didn't discover this history racket earlier, because I was a sociologist. And I think I've become a better historian than I was a sociologist. Besides, history, how hard can that be,
Yeah,
right?
no, it's pretty easy.
And so I got into the writing, and so I said, I think I can do a good job of writing these family stories. Why don't I write the stories of my own family, right? And then write them in the same way that I wrote that other book, that is within the context of the time and place in which they took place. So it really grew out of this. So let me explain, first of all, start out by explaining the title. And let me say, to wrap that point up, I think what this is, I like to see this as a book of Cuban history with a family story inside, or maybe it's the other way around, a family story with Cuban history inside, and one of the two. Right, but that's what it is, and I hope that what I do is I'm able essentially to provide a certain perspective on some events that we know took place, the broader historical forces, but how they really affected individuals on the ground, especially my family. Let me explain the title, and to do that, I'm going to read a segment at the very beginning of the book, "The House on G Street," and I named it that. That's the way my family referred to it. because when they moved from Central Cuba, when my father's father moved from Central Cuba with his children, they lived in a variety of rental homes in Havana until he finally built this house in 1929, which is on the corner. Those of you who are Havana topography people, right? It's on the corner of G and 15th Street, right? And Avenida de los Presidentes is also another name for G Street. And he built, it's a large house. He had 10 children, right? And my father was the oldest male, the fourth one of the children, but the oldest male. And so he has the name of his father, Lisandro, as I have that name, Lisandro, which I found out, by the way, looking finally at the birth certificate that I found of my grandfather, is that his name was not originally Lisandro. That is, Lisandro was not his first name. It was his middle name. And his first name that he was given was, are you ready? Leocadio. So, apparently he came to the conclusion that his middle name was exotic enough, and so he used that and never used the other one, for which I am, of course, grateful. So, in terms of explaining the title, that's and we always refer to it. The family was always referred to this house as La Casa de la Calle. So it made every sense to call it, the house on G Street. And I decided that I was going to base the narrative essentially, or ground the narrative, at least initially, in the house. In October 2015, when I visited, I would always, every time I'd go back to Cuba, I started going back in 1979, I would visit this house. And in October 2015, when I went there, it had been closed. That is, it had been, it was shuttered. It was appeared to be abandoned, right? And that's when I started thinking I'm going to base a book there. And not only that, I started writing literally the book there. That is, there's a bench across as you'll see, across the street, across from the house in the promenade on G Street. And I took my Surface Pro and I sat down at the bench and literally I started writing the first paragraph of the book. So this is what I have. I sit once more on the bench directly across from the house on G Street. It's October 2015. There are many benches on the promenade that runs along the median of the street. But during my visits to Havana, I always sit on this bench, the one facing the house. I sat here with my father in the year 2000, on the day of his 80th birthday, during his only trip back to Cuba since he left the island 40 years before. We both sat on the bench for a long time, gazing at the house and saying almost nothing. We can't go in and visit the house, I told him, because it's a daycare center full of toddlers, and we can't just walk in unannounced. We would not be welcomed. He did not question that, and I was glad he did not. At this distance from the bench, the house did not look too different from when he lived there for 18 years, excuse me, from the time he was 10 years old to the time he left the house in a tuxedo with tails to marry my mother. The house's exterior still had the reddish brown color of unpainted stone, just as when it was first built. The tall iron fence that encloses the property was intact, as was the colonnade that frames the front portico. As seen from the bench, one of the columns even mercifully covered the sign near the front door that proclaimed the daycare center's name, Vietnam Heroico. So this is what I decided. Let me base this in this house, which, like I said, when I sat there in 2015, it was shut close. It was shuttered. And that sort of, in many ways, affected me quite a bit because I didn't realize the depth of my connection to the house. Let me continue reading further on. The closure made me realize the depth of my emotional connection with the house on G Street, a connection I still do not quite understand. I never lived there. When my parents married, they went to live in an apartment in Miramar, a new suburb at the time. I lived in that apartment until 1960. When I was 11 years old and my parents decided we would leave the country. But every Sunday, My parents, my brother, and I would join my uncles and aunts and their children for lunch at the house on G Street. Perhaps it was the sense of belonging that came with those weekly lunches, with uncles and aunts doting over every niece and nephew, and with all those cousins as playmates. The house gave me, my life, a sense of stability, with its spaciousness and solidness. I knew my grandfather had built it and that my father and his siblings had grown up in it. I imagined what it must have been like to live there at the time my father was a child, and how the house and its occupants shaped my life in many ways. The house was the physical representation of my family legacy. And once I no longer lived in Cuba, it became in my mind the reference point for everything that had been and would never be again. The house on G Street became Cuba for me. And I found that the closure of the house also affected my aunt, who was at the time in 2015, the last surviving child of my grandfather, that is the last surviving sibling of my father, who was still alive at this time. And in October 2015, when I was there, and I said she lived in Alta Habana. I always saw her, would see her frequently when I go to Cuba, but I saw her on the way to the airport. And it was the last time I saw her because she died a few months later. And Leticia was her name. And she was really, she had been writing to embassies and places. Can't you see if you can, adopt this house, put it to, because she was concerned that it would be essentially destroyed, abandoned, right? And so she put her hand on my chest when I left and she said, nobody here remembers that house. My children were too young. They don't remember this house. My grandchildren, obviously not. You remember this house. So you have to do something to save this house, as if I could do that, right? And that sort of, again, gave me this sense of legacy, right? That it was kind of up to me, right, to do this, right? Well, she died like a year after that, and she instructed her children to spread her ashes on the grounds of the house on G Street, right? And 6 months later, lo and behold, the construction crews arrived and they started fixing up the house, and it's open again as a daycare center, right? Which is, in terms of a fate of old houses, not the worst fate, right? That it could befall a house like that, given the fate of many other houses like that. Really? Okay. I don't know if I can get closer to the microphone, right?
The mic closer to you.
Okay. Oh, bueno, okay, está bien. All right, we will speak up. So I have to be like a rock, right? No, bueno, está bien. Pero I thought that was, I mean, I teach in a room.
Cuban to
And
speak.
I teach in a room larger than this without a microphone. So maybe it's the microphone that's making me, speak lowly.
Yeah,
Really?
they're not great.
All right, okay. So basically the structure of the book, I alternate between essentially my father's family and my mother's family. My father's family, the Perez's, and my mother's family, the Fonts. And I start the book with the arrival in Cuba in 1823 of the Fonts. Their sort of genealogy is pretty well known. They have their genealogy is in the Historia de las Familias Cubanas. So I didn't have to do that work. I knew when they arrived, I knew where they were from, I knew who the descendants were, and so forth. And so it varies, it goes from chapter back one family to another. There are 6 characters, I think, that intergenerationally anchor the story. And I'll briefly talk a little, actually, the core of my presentation is just to kind of talk about them. So you'll see a bit how I've tried to incorporate this family story with, again, the larger, flow of Cuban history. And I have really 3 themes as I go through these characters and tell the stories associated with them. There are really 3 themes, historical themes, that I focus on. One is, and I don't want to expand on these now, I'll look at them later. One is the intimate nature of the colonial struggle, right? In other words, the notion that that this was not, well, I'll get into that later, but the idea that in terms of the colonial period, if you look at it in terms of families, families were divided, right, between Spanish and Cubans, right? It was almost like instead of being a war of, I guess colonialism or whatever, it was almost like a civil war, in the sense that it was again between even members of a single family, right? The other theme, the second theme, is this notion of Americanism, as in Americanos, or if you want Platism, if you want to use the term, of the Platt Amendment, the notion of Americanism and American influence versus Cuban nationalism. And that's something that runs through the book in these various characters. And the third one, not sort of related to that, pretty much related to that, is the fragility and the inherent contradictions of the Cuban Republic, right? And I think there is where especially the story of my great-grandfather is important, because he was actually a player in the Cuban Republic. And you see it in the ground, this fragility of the Cuban Republic, and the fact that although, again, the US played this tremendous influence in Cuban affairs in the 20th century, Cubans behave badly, right? In a political sense, right? And this is, you see this in various points, inflection points in the work. So the first and major character that I have is Coronel Ernesto Fonsi Sterling. He was my great-grandfather on my mother's side. He was my maternal grandfather's father. Okay, my mother's grandfather, if you will. And he was born at the time of the outbreak of the 10-year war. He was born in 1869. His father was deported to Spain for his activities in pro of independence. He comes under the influence. He comes under the tutorship of his aunt, who in a sense sort of adopts him, and she is Hilaria Fons, his aunt, and she's married to Miguel de Aldama, as in, again, the Aldama Palace and so forth, right? And when Aldama comes to New York, he stays here for many years. I have this whole story, and I connect that with the whole story that's in my first book on Cubans in New York in the 10-year war. When he comes here later on, my great-grandfather comes to New York as well, and Aldama places him in a military school in the Hudson Valley, right? Up in Mount Pleasant Military Academy. I'm talking 1870s, late 1870s, early 1880. And he gets this sort of discipline, military discipline. He learns English, right? And he also learns these conservative values. I have in the book the kind of the credo of the school, and it's like, we don't want to fool too much with progressive education. We think conservative values are good enough, And he gets he's a law and order guy. He has a respect for discipline, and he's a very exacting and sort of demanding sort of individual, right? And well, he does not graduate. He doesn't take a secondary degree from Mount Pleasant because Aldama returns. And Aldama returns to Cuba. He returns to Cuba with Aldama, and then he eventually gets a degree in bookkeeping. He enters a war. He's in the War of Independence. He signs up for the War of Independence. He becomes a colonel in the War for Independence, rises through the ranks, right, and eventually becomes a cabinet minister in the government in arms, in charge of all the finances. When the U.S. administration comes in, he's hired as the auditor, as one of the auditors in the U.S. military government. And there's this tremendous amount of paperwork on him in the National Archives, because the archives are all there, of the U.S. military government. So he was the one with the most footprints, right, in the historical record. And it was with him that I had the greatest challenge of kind of interpreting his life, because he was also a player. He had three inflection points here in this whole history. One is in 1902, when he has to supervise the transfer of the financial records from the military government of Cuba to the Cuban government, in which he's now the auditor. and he gets involved in these, conflicting forces. 1906, when he's named to the cabinet of the second Estrada Palma administration, right? But of course, it ends up in a conflict with the liberals, in which that administration doesn't come through, and he resigns as cabinet minister, as did the whole cabinet, in a very controversial move. And then in 1917, when he is the manager of a very large U.S.-owned sugar mill that's being threatened by La Chambelona, by the whole rebellion of the liberals against the electoral fraud by Mario Garcia Menocal. And he's many times in these conflicting forces. But the interesting thing about him, and I do want to read something about the nature of him, because I found so many things in the archives in Washington on his role in the auditor's office. And this is a passage that my son pointed out to as being very indicative of who he was, and who was this sort of law and order guy, discipline, bookkeeper, by the book. Communicating in Spanish with the municipalities, schools, hospitals, charities, and other institutions that receive funds from the government, and ensuring that their financial reports were in order, with all expenditures properly entered and documented, was a major task of Ernesto's office, because he was, again, worked in the auditor's office of the provisional government of the U.S. And he hired Cubans as subordinates, training them in the new accounting systems the Americans had introduced. It was painstaking work, and Ernesto attended to every detail. The records of the Office of the Auditor of the Military Government in the U.S. National Archives contain hundreds of documents produced by Ernesto's office and personally signed by him. In one letter, for example, dated March 18, 1901, to Sister Isabel de los Desamparados, the Mother Superior of the San Jose Asylum in Santiago de Cuba, Ernesto thanks her for the receipts she submitted in support of her financial report, but returns the report to her, asking her to correct and resubmit it because she did not specify the quantity and unit price of the dozens of pairs of footwear, pantuflas y alpargatas, listed on her ledger sheet. I mean, she doesn't even take the nun's word for it, right? Rejected, send it back, right? You know what I'm saying? That's the kind of guy, right? And so I think that was part of who he was, and how, in many ways it explains very much how he was a very much an individual by the book. There was always, one of the things about using family stories is that they're always idealized, right? And so you always get these idealized family stories. And this is a guy which I could do quite a bit of research on. And what I finally concluded about him, after thoroughly, and I'll read this part, after thoroughly researching his life, I have no reason to contradict the reverential image of Ernesto that was passed on to me. But my research also allowed me to arrive at a more nuanced picture of him. His life was charted by certain innate personality characteristics that were molded by a military school education in the United States during his most impressionable years, and by the harshness of the Cuban battlefield. He had a profound respect for authority and an admiration of American society and culture that led him to view favorably the influence of the United States in shaping the destiny of Cuba. More than once, his loyalties were tested as he found himself in the middle of forces unleashed by the political volatility of the Cuban Republic. Although he undertook actions that could be judged as questionable or misguided, they were actions wholly consistent with his character and beliefs. His decisions were guided by his sense of duty and personal integrity, decisions that cost him the level of prosperity and influence enjoyed by others around him, and ultimately cost him his health and his life. Ernesto's loyalty and sacrifices went largely unrewarded in that republic in which many of his fellow war veterans lost their way, cashing it in the ample opportunities for corruption. It is difficult, given the trajectory of his life, not to feel a certain sense of pathos at his untimely death. And he dies at the age of 48. And I think that's one reason that he doesn't have a greater profile in Cuban history, because he dies that young. But in researching it, I was amazed at his funeral. I mean, it was a big deal. It was huge. right? In terms of the president, everybody, the horses, the carriage here, the laying in state. I mean, the Cuban Congress adjourned for that day. And so he was an individual who had been a player. And I think, again, it depends on where you stand on the Cuban political spectrum, but he was, I think, unavowedly a Platist. I think he was a pro-American sort of individual. And I think there were a number of decisions that he did take that I think have been questioned by historians, especially his resignation in 1906, in order to allow a foreign intervention to take place, which is what happened to the Palma cabinet. All right, a second person. Where are we? I want to make sure.
20 minutes.
Okay, all right. A second person is Lisandro Perez Moreno, who was my grandfather, my father's father. He was an orphan, born in Remedios, one of the original villas de Cuba, one of the most, oldest of the towns in Cuba. And he was an orphan, and he was really destined to a life of poverty, except he had this great entrepreneurial sense and work ethic. And he starts a business exporting leaf tobacco to the United States. And he grows this business slowly. He's only 2 years younger than the ancestor who signed up, Ernesto, on the other side of the family, but he does not go to war. And I think part of it was that he had built this business on interpersonal relations with these vegueros and with his distributors and so forth, and it allowed him to escape poverty. He made the decision not to join the War of Independence. And he had this, he was rooted in this area of central Cuba that I described quite a bit, right? Which are las villas, essentially. Remedios, Camajuaní, Hueltas, Placetas, Sas el Medio, Yaguajay, all these towns that formed essentially las villas, which were a relatively isolated sort of area. And he built this business and grew it to the level of prosperity where, yes, he built this big house on G Street, right? And he sent his sons to study in the U.S. And he built that house, and he, enjoyed a level of prosperity. Again, he wasn't like the richest man in Cuba by any means, but he was essentially an individual who had still remained, although he moved to Havana eventually, remained very much rooted, right, in the soil of Las Villas and in that business that brought him that prosperity. And my father tells a story about how one time when he was back one summer from the school which he attended in New York, and I'll read that. When my father was just 14, he was wandering around the Despalillo, the stemmery, right, in Camajuaní, when he encountered a tobacco leaf that had been dropped on the floor. He mindlessly kicked it out of the way. A few months later, an employee told him that Lisandro, his father, wanted to see him in his office, which was on a mezzanine level that overlooked the entire facility. When he went into the office, his father told him that he had seen how he had treated that tobacco leaf and admonished him that, quote, "In this family, we treat a tobacco leaf with respect because it was pays for everything. The clothes you're wearing, that big house in Vedado, and that fancy school in New York. Don't ever forget that." And I think that was part of what he always instilled in his children, this notion that, we've moved to Havana and we have this fancy life, but let's not forget essentially where we came from. My father would tell me these stories, but occasionally he would also say, "El viejo era de carajo," like the old man was really some help me, right? Because he was precisely that way. I think his case is very interesting also because eventually he sells his business to General Cigar. General Cigar, which was, of course, the manufacturer of White Owls, Robert Burns, and so forth, and they now make the Macanudos, right? General Cigar essentially bought him out, but they kept him on because of his expertise. So they created a company called the General Cigar Company of Cuba Ltd, a wholly owned subsidiary of General Cigar, and he agreed to be the president of that. But they gave him full control over the operations in Cuba because, of course, nobody from Pennsylvania that was running the operations of General Cigar was going to know better than he did all the processes, because this was a very long process. And one of the things that I'm really very proud of is the chapter in which it's ethnographic. Because what I've done is that through interviews with my father, through interviews with a relative in Camajoni and consulting the sources, I've actually traced every step of the way of the leaf from the moment it is purchased from the veguero all the way to the moment it is shipped out of Havana to New York. And that process was 7 years and a whole set of processes and steps that took place: stemming, fermenting, packing, repacking, send it to Havana, send it back. It was an extremely complex operation that he ran, right? And he was essentially left in charge of that. And it's a case where, despite the fact that we know that the US exerted this tremendous influence, right, in Cuba, and essentially was buying up so many companies and many corporations in Cuba, there was Cuban agency in many ways, right? He ran that operation. And I have here a part where I talk about the process of buying from the veguero, which was kind of a game of the price setting and whatever. There were years in which some of his competitors would start making offers to a few vegueros. Vegueros are, of course, the tobacco farmers, at a price that Lisandro considered unreasonably high. They wanted to drive up the price because they had a glut in inventory and had no intention of buying much of the new crop, but did not want that inventory devalued with a lower price that year. This would usually set off panic buying from others who were concerned that the best Vegas would be bought up. One year, that panic reached the boardroom in New York, and General Cigar sent Lisandro a telegram ordering him to start buying at the higher price. But Lisandro knew the game and held fast, telegramming the Americans in Spanish, he never learned English, that if they wanted to buy at those prices, they were welcome to go down to Cuba and to do it themselves, because he was not going to do it. He was in charge of the operations, he reminded them, and he would decide when to buy and at what price. New York backed down, the panic subsided, and he made offers that year that were in line with the actual market. The suits in the offices on 40th Street never meddled again. So again, this was the case of, a U.S. corporation that in many ways it's run entirely, right, by this Cuban, right? Let me jump ahead a bit. Another of my characters here is Amparo Rodriguez Vidal, his wife, my father's mother. And the reason I have her here also, it's important, is because she is a great example of this intimacy of the conflict during the La Colonia, right? She comes from a mixed Spanish-Cuban family. Her father was Spanish, her mother was Cuban. She had a number of uncles and aunts, and two of the uncles actually were killed in the War of Independence. That is, they were, pro-independence. One of them, the name might be recognizable to some of you, Leoncio Vidal y Caro. The park in Santa Clara is named after Leoncio Vidal, right? Because he was killed in March of 1896, attempting to do something that hadn't been done before and would not be done since, which to take a major city, right, Santa Clara, and he was killed there. And he was again an uncle of my aunt, of my grandmother, excuse me. An aunt of my grandmother married a Spanish officer, right? And she looked askance on all this activity of her brothers. She eventually went back to Spain when her husband's tour of duty was done in Cuba. And she had two sons, both of them born in Placetas in Cuba. And one of them was Emilio Mola y Vidal. And as some of you are familiar with the Spanish Civil War, you know that General Emilio Mola y Vidal, who became a general after his exploits in the war in Morocco, was the one who attempted the coup of the Second Spanish Republic that failed, and which then led to the Spanish Civil War. So he's regarded as one of the principal instigators of the Spanish Civil War. And again, this combination of a Spanish Spanish and both Cubans in the family. And Leoncio, her uncle, who was, very well known as and died in Santa Clara, would sometimes sneak into Camahoni. And one of the stories that my grandmother would tell would be that he remembers Leoncio at the dinner table disguised as a priest, right? Because he would sneak into Camahoni, There were no fronts in this war, right? So again, this was one of the more sort of foremost example of that theme. So subsequent generations, just mentioned my maternal grandfather, Oscar, who had a tremendous influence on my life. Oscar was his father, before he died, said, you have to send these two boys to military school in New York. And so his widow, my great-grandfather's widow, came to New York, settled in a residential hotel on the corner of 70th Street in Columbus, and sent the two boys up the river to New York Military Academy. And that's a second ancestor now who's educated in the US. And in addition to that, my father. The reason I mentioned that is because one of the things I always wondered about is why was my childhood so unusual, in the sense that I went to an American school and I lived in Cuba during the 1950s, which one novelist called those American years, right? In this sort of binational existence. When I look at the history of my family, the educations in the US, the business with the US and General Saga, right? The way in which my great-grandfather again favored this presence of the US and Cuba, it couldn't be otherwise, right? That I would be sent to an American school. My aunt, the nun, always chided my father for that, because she believed I was missing out on a religious education, right? And I should have gone to a proper boys' religious school. But I was sent to an American school where we had essentially, classes in English in the morning and classes in Spanish in the afternoon. And it was this sort of, and I was exposed to these two sort of conflicting discourses, right, of Americanism and nationalism. In the morning we had US history taught by a teacher who exuded, American superiority in many ways, and taught her history course that way. And then in the afternoon, us Cuban students were taught by La Señora Valdez, who had this very nationalistic take on Cuban history, right? And far from being confused, I thought it was, enriching in many ways, right? And it was that kind of education that I had received. My grandfather, Oscar, my mother's father, was one who believed greatly, right, in the influence of the US and Cuba. And he himself, would almost every week go to the Minimax supermarket that was located on Quinta Avenida in Miramar. And he'd buy things like canned beets that he learned to eat in the Hudson Valley, and wholesome sliced bread, and the Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine and things of that nature. And he had a gun collection that included an antique gun collection that included the model of the gun that was used in Lincoln's assassination. That sort of, and so again, he was very fiercely Cuban in his identity. He had this influence of the US. He insisted in the two houses he built, right, that they have fireplaces. And not, the fancy fireplace. No, brick fireplaces like in the Hudson Valley, and so he had this sort of, but again, he always spoke of los Americanos in the third person. Estos Americanos, esos Americanos. He could never, for example, figure out why Americans like Jerry Lewis. I mean, we couldn't make heads or tails out of Jerry Lewis movies, what I'm saying? So, but he was one of those adults who listened to me. He took me everywhere. He taught me how to play chess on, he said, the same set that he used to play many years before, a simultaneous with Capablanca, right? And with a great chess champion, Jose Raul Capablanca, of course. And so he was a great influence in that sense in my life. And he, like his father, dies prematurely in He's 56 years old. He leaves me a stamp collection that charges me with organizing. And again, he forms part of this legacy that I inherit essentially. I won't say too much about my father, other than because I don't have a lot of time. But again, he was educated in New York, and he also embodied this contradiction of Americanism and nationalism. Because what he did was eventually his job in Cuba was importing American manufactured goods, Royal typewriters, Bell and Howell projectors, scientific equipment. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Scientific equipment. So essentially, he used his English, which he spoke perfectly, to do these business, import business. But yet he was a nationalist, right? He belonged to the Partido del Pueblo Cubano, the Orthodoxo party, headed by Chivas, right? And he was always, when again the revolution comes, he is very much sort of, in favor of, a reassertion of Cuban sovereignty, especially through the confiscation of U.S. properties. And the latter part of the book then is essentially memoir. That is, it's my memory of those years in which I remember how Cuba essentially was inexorably going into this tremendous change, which in many ways I witnessed. The first violent sort of attack that takes place against the Batista dictatorship in Havana occurs on October 29th of 1956, and it takes place in the same city block that my school is in, when the Havana police attacks the Haitian embassy on 7th Avenue. And my school was on, and we heard the shots, and that's where I started wondering what's going on in this country, right? And so that's when essentially the book becomes a bit of a memoir, but I reject the idea that it's a memoir. To me, my memory comes in as another piece of information that I use to build the story, right? So it's not centered on my memories, and even my memories, I couch them again in this contextualization of what happened and what happened during this period of time. Eventually, my father decides that we're going to leave Cuba in October of 1960. And he does, and I think part of the reason that he does so is not because he has a great deal of ideological problems with the Cuban Revolution. It's because once the government announces the nationalization of the schools, it becomes evident that maybe, our other relatives were right, our other relatives who were leaving, that this was sort of communism, and we were going to have the children sent to the Soviet Union to be indoctrinated, and the whole sort of story that leads to the Pedro Pan operation. Actually, my brother and I left. My brother was younger. My brother and I left earlier than our parents, but we were not in the Pedro Pan operation because we already had an aunt and an uncle in Miami who received us. So we didn't form part of that, but it's the same sort of process. I just want to end by reading this final, it's from the epilogue. And I just want to finish with what I have here in the epilogue, which kind of summarizes things a bit. I had an extraordinarily rich childhood in Cuba, a large network of family and relatives living in the same city, and whom I saw frequently. My early interest in family history, the sense of legacy represented by the house on G Street or in Oscar's stamp collection, all these and other experiences led me to develop what psychologists call a strong intergenerational self, often seen with children who know that they belong to something bigger than themselves. The book is the best evidence that I never lost that strong intergenerational self, despite my dislocation from the place and the dispersion of my extended family. Only a few family members stayed in Cuba, while the rest left for Miami, New York, Spain, or Puerto Rico. Returning to visit the island was not possible for 20 years. Faced with that distance from the people and the place that had nurtured my sense of belonging, I willed myself to remember that place and time and the people close to me who inhabited them. which is why I retain such a sharp memory of my childhood in Cuba, much sharper than the memories of my subsequent childhood years in the US. That's why I don't see there's a sequel. There isn't, I don't see a Cuban American book. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of Cuban American adjustment to the new life in this country book. I don't know. It's not a period that I have that fresh in my mind, right? Whereas these years before it are memories that I held on to, right? And that I finally put in this book. I have a lot of stories I left out actually, but I think that's good enough for now.
That's good enough.
All right, thank you.
Well, we'll open this up to questions from the audience. Anyone who wants to jump in here? Yes, please.
The book, she's asking what year the book ends. The book ends when I leave Cuba. And that is the last scene before the epilogue, of course, because the epilogue is more of a reflection, right? But the last scene, the action, if you will, is when my brother and I board Pan Am flight, I know I have it there, on October 29th, 1960, right? And we leave for Miami. That's the end of the book. It's right. That's what I'm saying. I don't think that book is, I don't have that book. In other words, that maybe no, but I don't see that book. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes. Right. This is not a Cuba book. This is not a Cuban American book. It's a Cuba book. Right. Yes, thank you, Ida. You're right. Yep.
Other questions? Yes, please.
When I use them.
So first you have an anniversary coming up, October 29.
Yes.
So how many years have you been in America from then?
Got to do math now.
1960. No, I have to do
Yeah.
math. Let's see, 63.
63 years, huh?
Yep.
¿Quién hubiera dicho?
You're right.
How was it for you experiencing these stories in your present moment?
You mean now, like redoing?
You know, looking at your family, I would assume that you experienced it like if you were there as you were researching.
Well, I think it's true that you don't really sharpen your memory, your thought, your mental processes until you have to write. When you write is when then you start you in a sense it becomes more precise and you sharpen even the memories, right? And so I sort of relived. This book was a lot easier to write than the other one, right? The other book is very, very heavy on the research. This has a lot of research, right? But it was easy sitting down and writing these stories, right? The other book took me like 10 years to write. This one, maybe 3 years of actual writing, and about half of it in the last year or so. Because I think that these memories came up and I was able to, like I said, my purpose in this book was to do the memory seamlessly with the research I had done, right? So John mentioned this, the story in the book about how my mother says that she dropped me when she was bathing me, right? She was using one of these little baby bathtubs that used to be and used at the time, which was like this rubber thing that was held in place by folding sort of legs that enabled the person to bathe the child at the height, you know, and then stoop over, right? And the rubberized canvas was sort of filled with water and it had a little plug at the bottom. So that's a story she says, and that's, I flew off, I was all soaked up, and I flew off and I fell head first on the floor. But there, it allows me, really, I mean, she said that I bounced off the
That's,
floor.
yeah,
I don't know, but that allows me, because then I say, okay, what were these things? She described it to me.
Mm.
What were these things, right? So you look it up, and the thing that I also wanted to say that I didn't say is that this book, although I felt I should have written it a long time ago, was really not possible until now with the kind of research that can be done online. So I was like, okay, who made that bath, whatever, right? Sure enough, the Baby Bath-Annette Company in Pittsburgh made those, and relevant to the increasing Americanization of Cuba, they were sold exclusively in Sears Roebuck Company stores, which allowed me to say then that in 1947, the Sears Roebuck in Havana was the first Sears and Roebuck outside of the United States. So this is, again, you see the connection of the family story, right, with some research that addresses that issue of the Americanism and so forth, right? So I think that's part of what happened when these memories, and I place them in that sort of context. My mother, I don't know if she knew, I mean, she might have bought it in Sears and Roebuck, but I never got that part of the story, right? That's sort of supplemented. There's another example of that, but I won't get it.
Other questions?
I don't know if I asked you a question, but
Other questions? No?
No.
Yes, yes, please.
Get to think.
behave badly in addition to corruption, for example, according to the perceptions of your relatives?
well, we read what happened to the Cuban Republic and the various kinds of things that happened, right? And again, we talk about the fact that, and it's true that the Cuban Republic had an abnormal birth with the Plan Amendment, because what the Plan Amendment basically meant was, especially through Article 3, in which the U.S. retained the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. What happened was that the U.S. became essentially the ultimate arbiter of the Cuban political system, right? So what would happen would be that if you didn't like the result of the election, justifiably or not, if you made enough trouble and threatened life and property, which is what the Platt Amendment called for, that the U.S. would intervene in Cuban affairs if life and property were threatened, then you could have that election nullified. Maybe the U.S. would take over, there would be a new election, and you could be elected. This is what was called interventionist politics, right? And the Cubans played this card, right? There's plenty of evidence that the 1906 election was stolen. Palma was an honest president from a financial point of view, but it seems the 1906 election was stolen. The liberals revolted. Roosevelt sends Taft down there to try to work out a deal, right? And the Cuban president, Palma, says, no deal, right? I'd rather resign and get the U.S. to intervene rather, right, than work this out with the opposition party. And that's exactly what happened. And my great-grandfather Ernesto was part of that because he was on that cabinet, right? And when that whole cabinet says, okay, well, we're going to resign because we don't want to deal with the liberals, right? So we want to force the U.S. intervention. And of course, in the context of nationalistic sort of Cuban history, this doesn't play well, right? Because essentially what that Cuban government did, right, was to resign, right, before having to negotiate with the opposition and favor a U.S. intervention, right? And then there's, in 1909, Jose Miguel Gomez gets elected. He institutes an entire system of patronage that existed because there was no civil service, right? And so what now becomes important is access to government. And many Cubans, after the war were impoverished, and the one vehicle for social mobility was, through elections, through get elected to the government, through the government, right? There was that cartoonist, I don't know if somebody in the Diario de la Marina, where every time a politician was said, I have a job for you, he then thinks, and there's a ham, right? It's like un jamón, right? Which is the idea of, not serving, but being served by public service, right? And again, in 1917, this is another one in which my great grandfather is involved in. 1917, Menocal simply, steals the election outright. I mean, the results were coming in. The New York Times said it looks like the liberal Sayas has been elected. All the results, the election results stop, right? And 2 days later, boom, Menocal is announced as the president, right? This kind of shenanigans, which again, yeah, the notion of blaming the US for that goes only so far. And Manuel Marquez Esterly said it, right? In light of foreign meddling, domestic virtue. And that domestic virtue never happened, right? And so my great grandfather, again, when the liberals were in power, he had no access to public employment, which is something that he sort of depended on. He came out of the war really without any money, right? And there's an anecdote that's in the book, right? That during the years of Jose Miguel, he's invited to a reception at the palace honoring the veterans, right? And he manages to squeeze into his old uniform and everything, and he's going there. And they're walking towards the palace, and his wife Malila tells him that the fontsmen have an inclination when they get older to hunch over. They have my grandfather was this way. I even have a cousin who's this way. They kind of start getting hunched over, right? And Malila says to him, Ernesto, enderezate. Cada día está más jorobado. No, Ernesto, straighten up. Cada día you're more bent over. And he answers back, ay, Malila, si esta gente no me pueden tragar jorobado, imagínate tú si me enderezo. In other words, if these people cannot swallow me, right, accept me, bent over, imagine if I straighten up, right? Which was, again, the notion that, if there was no civil service, if you did not belong to the political party in power, essentially you were out, right? And fortunately, one of his brothers came to the rescue with a kind of a job at the National Bank, and then he got this gig of at running this huge central. And one of the things that I'm also proud of is there's certain ethnography about the central, right? Because this is the Delicias and the Chaparra in Eastern Cuba. And when I was researching that, it's not just a sugar mill. It's a city. It's a town. There was 5,000 people. There were stores, schools, running water. It was whoever ran that mill wasn't just running a mill. They were like a mayor of a town, right? And Ernesto suffered greatly from the stress of that job. He had an accident, and that's why he dies eventually in 1918 at the age of 48. And again, there's a certain pathos about his and his archive. By the way, I was able, not only did I do the research on him in other sources, but there is a surviving archive of him that I used, and that is now in the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami. We donated it like a couple of years ago. The accident was he was on a horse, and the horse essentially threw him, and he landed on the railroad track on his back, and it was a back problem, a broken sort of discs and that kind of thing. But he also was very disappointed with Menocal, because Menocal, who was actually one of the owners, Menocal hired him while he went to Havana to be president, hired him to run the sugar mill, and Menocal, also told him, you need to defend this sugar mill from the liberales who are running amok in Eastern Cuba in 1917. And he did his best, and the Central survived just fine. They had even more profits than the previous year, and yet Menocal did not like the fact that some cane fields were burned, and his precious house in the mill was used as a headquarters for troops, which he had sent to defend the Central, right? So, and he was very disappointed, and he resigned, and he went to Havana, and he died a few months later after that.
I wonder to what extent that system of corruption helps to explain why your grandfather, when he's approached by Machado, sort of demurs, right? He says, I don't want to run for office. And I wonder whether or not that isn't also a line in Cuban history of the business sector essentially looking at politics and saying, this is a dirty
Yep.
business and I want no part of it. I'm here to make money. I'm here to go to the Havana Yacht Club.
Yep.
Leave me alone. You know, I couldn't help but like think about him as a sort of counterweight to the colonel.
Yep.
You know, sort of saying, this isn't for me.
And it starts with even going to war, right? You know, as these two men, although one is my grandfather, the other is my great grandfather on the different sides, they're only 2 years apart in terms of their age. So Lisandro, my grandfather, my father's side, does not go to war, right? He's got a business that saved him from poverty, and he, you know, was not going to give that up. I'm sure that others made greater sacrifices, but the fact is he didn't. And he stayed, and not only that, the US intervention and the whole plan amendment brings greater business opportunities for him, right? Which in many ways brings some conflict into Ernesto's life on the other hand, right? So this is a case where many of the veterans, this was a problem with, you know, veterans who were left out of national life, really, and who again depended upon public service. And of course, it was even worse in the case of non-white, right, veterans of the war,
Right,
who found themselves shut off from not just the conservative government but the liberal government, and that's why you had the race war, la guerrilla, the race war of 1912.
Yeah.
Right? Because again, veterans were displaced. But my grandfather, you know, my father's side benefited from all this. And to go back to the story that John alludes to, when he's in this house on G Street and whatever, and he's successful, he's approached by Machado in, you know, 1925, 26, when Machado, of course, is at the height of his popularity. Saying why, you know, and the la casualidad, the chance thing is that Machado's from Camajuaní, right? So he knows my grandfather, and he approaches him. He needs respectable people on his government, right? So he offers him, why don't you run for senator from Las Villas and what? And my grandfather probably thought about it for a minute and said, yeah, no, for the same reason you're talking about. This is why do I want to do that, right? And in fact, you know, when then Machado, of course, goes from popular president to hated dictator, right? And he's finally overthrown. He has to leave the country in August of 1933. There were mobs of people that raided the homes of those that had been in his government, and one of those almost raided the house on G Street because they got it mixed up with another house. And they had to tell him, no, this isn't the house of that guy. It's over there. But it would have been, I mean, it would have meant that the family would have had to leave Cuba.
Right.
Had he been a senator under Machado's party, right? He would have to leave Cuba like you know, Desi Arnaz had to leave Cuba at that time. What's that?
His father was
Desi was the son of the mayor of Santiago de Cuba, who was Desiderio Arnaz Sr., and he was a Machado associate, and they leave in 1933 for Miami. Desi graduates from school in Miami, and if you go to Woodlawn Cemetery on 8th Street in Miami, you will see in the mausoleum that there is the niche, you know, where Machado and his wife are buried, and right above it is the niche where Desiderio Arnaz Sr. and his wife are buried. I don't know if that was his occupation, but his political, he was the mayor of Santiago de Cuba, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Who's the mic?
Right.
Thank you, Lisandro. This has been incredible. I've read the book a couple of times already, and it's great to hear all of this all over again and see it in your hand, right? And I'm just wondering, you mentioned stories you had to leave out. What's the thing you had to leave out that you're just like, that you really had to, it really killed you to have to leave it out?
You know, I actually remembered this story. Not that I remember it had been, I always knew the story, but it already when the manuscript is in, you know, in page proofs, I looked at that epilogue, which has the which has the point about the strong intergenerational self, about how I lived this childhood very much aware that I was, in this family and that I was the oldest, cousin of the oldest male of the patriarch in this sort of line, right? And I said, the story I should have put in there was the story of La Mula Concha. So the story of La Mula Concha, if I may.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
sure.
The story of La Mula Concha is that in 1956 or so, my uncle Sergio gets married. He's one of the last ones of all the 10 brothers and sisters who were able to get married. But he decides to marry a girl from Camajuani, Mari Pedroso, who they ran the local bakery in Camajuani. So that whole family, the 10 siblings, everybody and their children, everybody has to displace itself to Camajuani, right? And to this wedding, right? There. And I remember the wedding. I must have been, 7 years old, 56, something like that. And the following day, we decided to have the whole family, except the newlyweds, of course. The wedding was on a Saturday night. On Sunday, we were all going to go to La Finca Marina. La Finca Marina was this farm. I didn't write about that because, again, you can't get too far from the narrative, right? But La Finca Marina was a recreational farm that my grandfather had purchased in the outskirts of Camajuani on the highway from Camajuani to Remedios. And that, again, was part of his whole thing of staying near his roots, right? So when he would be in Camajuani, which was every week, he would go to look over his business in Camajuani. And I have that description of his weekly trips to Camajuani. He would go out to La Finca Marina. He had these sort of tenant farmers there who didn't have to produce a lot because, again, he wasn't looking at it as a productive farm. They just had to send pigs and whatever on Christmas to the Havana for the Noche Buena thing, but they weren't really producing all that much. And everything, but he would love to go to the farm. And he had there the mule that he used to use when he would buy from the vegueros. And it was a huge gray mule. I mean, it was it was tall. I mean, of course I was small, but it was a huge mule with these huge ears and these huge hoofs, right? And she was a mula concha. And she was the mule that he used when he went to the farm. He was a man, very routine oriented. He would take the same recorrido, the same path when he would survey his farm. So he would take the mule first to the watering hole and then over to where there was some tobacco planted. And then he had all these places where he would take the mule and stop, right? So, of course, he died in 1949. And on that Sunday that the whole family goes back, we go to La Finca Marina because we're going to have a barbecue. We're going to have a puerco y toda la cosa, right? And we decide to take the path, el recorrido of the old man. And how did they do that? They put me on top of the mule. They strapped me onto that mule. I felt like I was on top of the Empire State Building, They strapped me to that mule. Right. And everybody else, the whole family is behind in horses. And they tell me, just, give it a jolt, give the mule a jolt. And La Mula Concha went boom, 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 boom to exactly, right? El recorrido, right? To exactly the path with everyone behind. Now, if that's not a sense of intergenerational self where you're put on the mule of the old man, you know what I'm saying? And put on there and everybody else in the family is behind you. I don't, it's sort of like Leticia telling me, but as I mentioned, you're the only one who remembers this. Nobody here in Cuba except you and I remember this. Right. So it was a sense sort of legacy, right, that I tried to communicate here.
I think one final question and then we'll wrap up.
Oh, she had a question first. I'm sorry.
So I left that. So I'm sorry. That's the story. Obviously, if I wanted to make that point about the intergenerational itself, that's the story that I should have put in there, right? So this is bonus content.
Yes,
It's
it's not in the book. This is
not in the book. This is
yeah.
bonus content. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Lisandro, I had a question. What area of Habana was la casa en la calle G? Is that in the Vedado?
Vedado.
Miramar?
Yes, in Vedado. Hay is one of the principal arteries in Vedado. Of course, there's Paseo and Hay, which is Avenida de los Presidentes, and this was on G and 15th is the house.
But the house was owned by your family or your parents and it was expropriated or was sold?
Okay, so he built, but first of all, my grandfather built that house. He sold the business to General Cigar, and I think as a result of that, he had a windfall. The house, by the way, if I can just do one detail, it's a very functional house. You look at the houses in Vedado, and they have all these Corinthian columns and these cherubic, angels coming out of, this is a plain functional house in which there's a library and a living room and then a large central hallway that ends in the dining room and the kitchen, and all the bedrooms come out to the central hallway. In other words, it's a central hallway that vertebrates the house. This is why later on it became popular with the school. When the school, because it was perfect for a school. So in 1957, late 57, my family, there was only like a couple of aunts left, 2 or 3 aunts left living there. So they decided to rent the house out. And then the 3 or 4 remaining aunts, it was Mara and her 2 daughters and Gisela and Amparito. They move to a spacious apartment, 4-bedroom apartment in Vedado as well, very near to where the Hilton is, very centrally located. And they rent out the house. Okay, they rent it out first to a school or whatever, and eventually, yes, the state, when the revolution comes in, takes it over, right? And according to La Ley de la Reforma Urbana, right, the family in Cuba received, right, a payment for that. Obviously, not worth the Ley de la Reforma Urbana said essentially outlawed rental property. All right, so you couldn't have rental property. You could, if you were in a huge house like Dulce Maria Loinas, the poet, and she was in a huge house, she could stay there, right? But you couldn't, have rental property. So my family receives a sort of payment that was not probably the market value of the house, and they turn it into eventually into this daycare center. My aunts, who 2 of them stayed in Cuba, right, move into the spacious apartment in 1957, and so they're renting there, right? So under the Ley de la Reforma Urbana, yes, the house in G Street was lost, although indemnified, but they gained property to the apartment that they were living in, right? Because then there was no longer rentable, they were living in that apartment, right? So eventually, one of the aunts and her daughters left Cuba. There were 2 remaining aunts left there, and they died. And my cousin now lives there. I have a cousin who lives there, who was put on the nomina, or she was put on the
lease.
on the
Contract.
in the house, and she inherited the house, which is located on 21st and between L and M. So that's the dynamics of that. Okay, so the house, I guess, in that sense, was lost, but again, it's yes, it was lost, but then they got the property to the apartment.
New apartment. Anyway,
I do. I sometimes have stayed there, not as much as I'd like, because I don't know. When I go to Cuba, I have a lot of colleagues. I mean, I do research. I do have a lot of colleagues who come and see me, and it's just more convenient for me to stay in a place where I can receive people rather than stay. But Maria Eugenia, who's again one of my 4 cousins who stayed in Cuba. Eventually, one of them left. Has been living there since then, and she, this has to do with trying to have a sense of, again, because I had this sense of family. I did return to Cuba in the 79. I've been a link with that family, and what happened was that Maria Eugenia, that cousin, was living in that house, in that apartment, when these 2 aunts became, and my son remembers this because he's been there, when those 2 aunts became both deaf and blind, right, and needed care, right. So I wrote to all the cousins. You remember the Cristina? I wrote to all the cousins and I said, we got póngase pa su número. In other words, we gotta, everybody's got to contribute here because we have to send money because they need disposable diapers and they need all kinds of things like that. And they need a person 24/7. So we need to send them money until they both died. Like they were never married and they both died like, within months of each other. Right. And so they were in that house and eventually my cousin then stayed there and she's offered me to stay there. I usually don't. And just because it's a lot more convenient to stay in other places, but I might do that. Exactly. I was I walked in there in 1979 when I went back to Cuba, and the furniture was all the furniture that I remembered was there. And it still is the furniture that they brought over from the house on G Street that they put in that apartment. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So strange.
And again, those ants, you can imagine that those ants, their life, I mean, they stayed in Cuba, but their life was, the revolution affected them greatly, of course, in terms of what they were, but again, they never really formed part of the revolution in many ways. Lisandro, my son, when he was doing a documentary on the hip hop and the rap musicians and that he's done a documentary on, stayed with them, right? And he stayed in the bed where my grandmother slept, right? And that to anyone who's an immigrant, that is the idea, right? That you die in the bed where you always slept and where your mother slept, right?
Same mattress?
I don't know that. Probably not. But
Hopefully not.
But that
I'd argue against that.
you have that sort of stability.
Yeah.
When immigrants then are everywhere and they've gone everywhere, but that that place is kind of this,
Intergenerational connection, even in sleep, right?
Yeah.
On that note, we're gonna wrap up. Thank you all for coming. And join me in thanking Lisandro for sharing this wonderful book. Just as a postscript, there are copies of the book available in the back of the room. And in addition, although he did not mention it, there is a recipe for frijoles negro.
Yep.
So if you're not interested in history but are interested in food, I would recommend that to you.
Those are the Colonel Fonse's black beans.
Correct.
And
I don't know. It's in the back.
It's in the back. I'll sign any copies.
I also just very quickly, I did want to say thanks to the Cuban Cultural Center of New York for co-sponsoring this event with us, and also to our staff here at the Clackle, Fatima Vélez and Lidia Hernandez Tapia, who have been wonderful in helping to organize this event and staffing it. And also we have a special guest who's in the back, our chancellor, our CUNY chancellor, Felo Matos Rodriguez is here. So we're happy to see you and welcome you here. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for being here. Be well.
Thank you.
Says
Oh my God. Yeah, all right. She said she'd be sending somebody.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, she didn't send me. I was gonna
But
come
that's what she would say.
But I just texted her, you speaking.
Oh, yeah.
Lisandro. So-
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Very
so
Hell's Kitchen-ish anymore. It's a remarkable transformation. I tell my students all the time.